Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this special edition of our Alberta for Knowledge Translation webinar series. My name is Devon Brandis, and I am the Project Coordinator Knowledge Translation for the Alberta KT platform. I'm delighted to welcome you today to today's session called Introduction to Knowledge Synthesis and Systematic Reviews. In this webinar, our presenter, Dr. Meghan Sebastianski, will introduce the terms knowledge translation and knowledge synthesis, discuss the importance of evidence-based medicine, and share different strategic approaches. Dr. Sebastianski has a wealth of experience in clinical epidemiology, research methodology, and evidence-based decision-making. She is currently the Program Coordinator of Knowledge Synthesis for the Alberta SPOR KT platform. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this session is being recorded, and the link will be provided along with the presentation slides to all participants after the webinar. The format for today's webinar will be approximately 40 to 50 minutes of content with time for questions afterward. You can send your questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the chat screen, where they will then be addressed by the presenter at the end. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and on behalf of the Alberta SPOR Knowledge Translation Platform, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Meghan Sebastianski, and will now hand the microphone over to her.
Thanks, Devon. Well, when I talk about knowledge synthesis, I actually start with knowledge translation and the relationship between the two. So we're going to talk about both of those briefly, and then discuss the importance of knowledge synthesis and its importance to evidence-based medicine, as well as the different types of knowledge synthesis and their general structure. So as I mentioned, KS, or knowledge synthesis, is a component of KT, so we need to start there. So knowledge translation, it's a dynamic and iterative process, meaning that it is constantly changing and is ongoing. It includes the synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge. So you'll notice that the first part there is synthesis. So quite simply, KT is taking knowledge and turning it into action. So Sharon Strauss from St. Michael's in Toronto said that KT is a method for closing the gaps from knowledge to practice. Again, it's what we know and what we do. So implicit in this very simplified definition is that there are two groups involved, those who are producing knowledge and those that are using it. So just take a second and figure out perhaps which groups you fall into, and a lot of you might find that you're in both. So let's talk a little bit more about what those gaps are. So this diagram comes from CIHR, the Research to Practice Valleys. And in those hills, we see a great production of research and knowledge, and those large gaps labeled valleys are known as the valleys of death, or where research goes to die. So for those of you here today, you're most likely interested in valley number 2, which comes right after clinical science and knowledge development. And in order to bridge that valley, we really need to know how the knowledge can be disseminated and integrated into healthcare practice. And that's where knowledge translation is a means of addressing this challenge. So a key piece of understanding knowledge translation is understanding the knowledge to action cycle. So it's the guiding framework that defines and describes the components of KT. And these are the pieces that are necessary to bridge the knowledge to action gap, so those valleys of death. And you can see the role of KS in the cycle is at the very beginning. So then what is knowledge synthesis? So according to CIHR, it's putting research findings into context and integrating individual studies within a larger body of knowledge. Most importantly, a synthesis must be reproducible and transparent, and it can be qualitative or quantitative or both. So again, simplified, if you take all of the research knowledge that is relevant to your research question, so the big randomized control trials, the small individual studies, case reports, and you combine it with all your clinical knowledge, gray literature, conference proceedings, conversations, even experiences that patients have had, and you synthesize it into one document or one output. That is knowledge synthesis. And those outputs are determined by the user's needs. And so we'll talk about the outputs later on. So some of the characteristics of knowledge synthesis Going back to that main KS definition and those two important concepts of being reproducible and transparent. So to accomplish this, we use rigorous methodology, such as that developed by the Cochrane collaboration, and we ensure everything is well documented so that it can be reproduced. And the overall goal of knowledge synthesis is to minimize bias, and for that we have multiple quality assessment tools and reporting standards. Okay. So for me, when I think about the importance of knowledge synthesis, I think about the parable of the 7 blind men. So each man touched only a portion of the elephant and thus came to very different conclusions. So if somebody touches the tusk, he says, oh, it's a spear. And somebody else touches the ear and he says, no, it's a fan. And somebody else touches the tail and he says, no, it's a rope. And so it's the same thing with research evidence, is we have to remember that science is a cumulative process. Very few single studies are persuasive enough to change practice, and individual studies may be misleading due to bias. And so like the elephant, it's very important to look at all the evidence available in order to see the true picture. So when we talk about available evidence, so what we're putting into that synthesis funnel, it's important to remember that evidence comes in many forms. So this quality of evidence pyramid may be familiar to some of you. So at the bottom, we have unfiltered information. So that is your general background info, case reports, cohort studies, randomized control trials. And you can see that the volume of the unfiltered information is quite a bit bigger. And then as we move up the pyramid, the rigor of the methodology and the quality of the evidence increases. So we have the filtered information where the data comes from synthesizing the primary research that's found at the bottom of the pyramid. And you can see that systematic reviews sit at the very top. So if we talk about the evidence of knowledge synthesis and evidence-based medicine, so are there any guesses as to the average time it takes to get research into practice? You can just type your answer in the chat box. And this would be clinical research into practice, not bench research. Oh, you guys are pretty good. I'm impressed. Yes, it's 17 years. And surprisingly, it's only an estimated 14% makes it over that valley of death into day-to-day clinical practice. So with knowledge synthesis and knowledge translation, we can decrease that time lag. So other important uses of KS, healthcare professionals need to read about an average of 15 to 20 original articles every day in order to stay abreast of their field. Okay, so that's impossible. But with knowledge synthesis, what we can do is we can compile that information and put it into a single study or single abstract. And then basing decisions on a single study can be misleading. So a third of highly cited clinical research studies were either contradicted or were found to show reduced effect sizes in subsequent studies. And also KS can help answer questions that can't be addressed by individual studies. And to further with that, so I'm talking about meta-analysis. And so this is where you compile and analyze the group's data, and that allows us to increase power and improve the precision of the estimate of the treatment effect. Knowledge synthesis can also help settle controversies or generate new research ideas, and is a key part of bridging the gap between research and clinical practice or supporting evidence-based decision-making. So I'm going to provide a few real-world examples of the importance of knowledge synthesis. So this example is of Dr. Graham Liggins. He was a researcher in obstetrics in New Zealand in the late 1960s. And in 1969, he published a study on the use of steroids to accelerate lung growth and development in premature lambs. And he found that it increased survival rates. So he applied this animal model to humans. And in 1972, he showed that using glucocorticoids improved the survival rates of preterm babies with lung problems. So that sounds like a huge leap forward for medicine. But as you may have guessed, there was no immediate impact from his findings on clinical practice. In fact, the Lancet journal actually rejected his paper on the grounds that there would be very little interest. And then in 1995, so over 20 years later, a systematic review and meta-analysis was published that confirmed the use of corticosteroid therapy reduces the odds of neonatal respiratory distress syndrome by 50%. So this is the forest plot from that 1995 paper, and it included 14 other studies that had looked at this research question. So you can see Dr. Ligon's study is at the very top. And from the forest plot, you can see the vertical line in the middle is the line of no difference. And to the left, each of those studies has a point estimate surrounded by its confidence interval. So those that are on the left side of the vertical line favor treatment, and those that are on the right side favor control. And then this is the same study, but it's the cumulative forest plot where the number of patients in each study is added to those before it, and we can see very clearly the impact of the treatment. So again, this took over 20 years, and think of all the premature babies and their families that didn't benefit from this knowledge as it had been adapted when it was originally discovered in 1972. So as the Cochrane collaboration pointed out, this is an example of the human cost when we fail to systematically review the literature and use knowledge synthesis tools. In fact, the Cochrane logo that you see there is the image of the forest plot that I showed you from the systematic review. And it was after that systematic review that prenatal corticosteroid use was adopted into clinical practice. So another example is the use of aprotinin, which is a protein inhibitor that reduces bleeding during complex surgery. So a systematic review of 64 trials confirmed its effectiveness, but also noted that the benefit was apparent after only 12 trials. So think about the resources used in those additional 42 trials, both monetary and human resources, that could have been redirected elsewhere, and all of the patients that could have benefited from the drug treatment in the meantime. So one of the basic examples I use when somebody asks me what is knowledge synthesis is this example. So let's say you're interested in treating a specific condition, and you find a paper, or you find 5 papers that say drug A is better, and you find 5 papers that say drug B is better. Well, what do? And so that's why KS is important, is we look at the quality of those 10 studies. So were they randomized control trials? Were the subjects blinded? Was there bias in recruiting the patients? And we can combine the data and increase the precision of the estimate, and in the end tell you, for your population for this disease, in fact, drug B is better. So now that we know what knowledge synthesis is and why it's important, I'm going to touch on the different types of knowledge synthesis. So there are quite a few listed here, and when I previously mentioned the KS funnel and all the different outputs, these would be some of your options. Some of those that may be more familiar would be a literature review, a systematic review, maybe some of you have heard about a rapid review. So today I'm going to focus on 4 types of reviews that you are most likely to come across as a health researcher. And the first is a scoping review. So scoping reviews are used to explore the literature, and they identify key concepts, theories, and research gaps rather than answering a specific detailed research question. They are most useful in a large and diverse field. And they can also direct a systematic review. So for example, at Campus Alberta last summer, there was a research group had done a scoping review on food illiteracy in Alberta. And they actually found that there was no common definition for the term. So they ended up doing a systematic review on that. So if you were looking for the research, this is a good example of a scoping review, even though it outright tells you. It also says barriers and facilitators to the uptake of systematic reviews by policymakers. So again, very broad, very all-encompassing, like an environmental scan. So the second and probably the most common is a systematic review. And it's well named. It is a systematic review of the literature. It's a well-built source a search of multiple sources, and it examines the quality of the research to make sure that it is free from bias. It uses very similar methodology to the scoping review, but has a more specific research question. So for systematic review, there are a number of analysis options. They can be narrative, or it can also be quantitative. So in which case you're using statistical analysis. So here's an example of a systematic review. Interventions for treating ankle fractures in children. So you have a very specific population, children who have suffered ankle fractures, and there's a specific clinical problem that needs to be addressed. And then second to that is meta-analysis. So meta-analysis and systematic reviews oftentimes get mixed up. So it's important to note that a meta-analysis is always a systematic review, but a systematic review is not always a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is it's the statistical analysis of quantitative data that is gathered from the systematic review. So we combine the results of the selective studies, and it allows us to increase precision and power and provide the most accurate estimate of the treatment effect. So you can also do a meta-analysis using qualitative data, but we refer to that as a meta-synthesis. So here are a few meta-analysis examples. So from the first one, even though it outright tells you, you can tell that there's a quantitative component to these, something that can be measured and compared. Okay, and then the last one we're going to talk about is a rapid review. And this is an accelerated systematic review. It's usually used to provide quick evidence for decision makers. You use systematic methodology, but to meet that tighter timeline, you might use fewer databases, or perhaps you would only look at the last 3 to 4 years worth of citations. Generally, you look at a very specific research question that is small in scope. But because of these shortcuts, if you will, you reduce the rigor or the confidence of the results in comparison to a full systematic review. So because of their nature and their intended use, rapid reviews are not often published in databases. You need to look into the gray literature to find these. And there's some examples here. You'll notice it usually has a lot to do with quick decisions. So there were a lot of rapid reviews done for personal protective equipment for Ebola a couple years ago, and you could understand why they might need evidence in quite a rapid fashion. Systematic reviews generally take up to a year, depending on the scope of your research question, but a well-trained team can complete a rapid review in about 6 weeks. Okay. So even though there are lots of many types of knowledge synthesis outputs, they all tend to follow a very general structure. And so we're going to go through that structure step by step, but I'm mostly going to frame it around what would be done for a systematic review, since that's probably the most common one. Okay. So every knowledge synthesis starts with a well-built question, and the aim here is to identify the important components of your research question. So we use the PICO format, where P is your population of interest. It could be patients or a community. Your intervention is what you are testing. So it could be a drug, it could be a new program. C is the comparator. So what is the main alternative being considered? It could be a different drug, or it could be usual care, or the status quo. And O is outcome. So what are you trying to measure or improve, and how does it affect your population? And so we answer each one of those, and then we formulate it to build our well-built question. Okay, so here's an example. In patients with type 2 diabetes and obesity, is bariatric surgery more effective than standard medical therapy at increasing the probability of remission of diabetes? Well, here, our population is obese patients with type 2 diabetes. The intervention is bariatric surgery. The comparator is standard medical therapy. And the outcome is remission of diabetes. So you want to identify each of these PICO components in order to help build your search strategy. But before you do that, you want to develop a protocol. So this one is fairly straightforward. You want to know what needs to be done, who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, and when they're going to do it. It seems easy to just keep that in track in your mind, but it is very important to get it down on paper. It helps you and your team stay on track, and it's important for transparency. And I think you will be surprised when you're in the middle of doing 50 quality assessments how many times you might go back to look at that protocol to make sure you're staying on track. So once you have your research plan, you want to build your search strategy, and you want to build a comprehensive literature search. But this is not just a lit review. It's not just the best known papers or those with the most citations. You want to find every paper that is relevant to your research question. So in order to do that, we use two evidence sources. The first we refer to as primary literature, but this is anything that can be searched for in an electronic database. For a systematic review, we generally use 3 to 4 different databases. We also look at gray literature. Gray literature is hard to define. Generally, we say it's anything that's not in a searchable database, so that could include government reports, newsletters, even personal correspondence. But one important thing, too, is to document your search. So part of that transparency that we talked about at the beginning and the reproducibility is for someone to be able to go in and repeat your search, and they can't do that unless it's properly documented. So if you are undertaking any knowledge synthesis, I would strongly recommend working with a research librarian. They are worth their weight in gold. So there's a few things that they would definitely be able to help you with. The first is MESH terms, so that's the medical subject heading. So when you type in diabetes to a search engine, what is it that you are actually searching for? Is it type 1 diabetes? Is it type 2 diabetes? Is it gestational diabetes? Or when you type in the word child, there are almost 50 different ways to search for child, infant, baby, toddler. And so a search specialist would be able to help you identify each of those. They're also familiar with truncation. So diabetes versus diabetic will pull up different papers, as well as filters. So if you're only looking for randomized control trials, there isn't a little RCT button on the search engine that allows you to pull out only the RCTs. So information specialists have validated filters that will allow them to identify which are the RCTs, so you're not sorting through a bunch of papers that aren't relevant. And most importantly, search specialists are well-versed in database syntax. So because in a systematic review you would be using 3 to 4 databases, each one of those databases uses its own syntax. So you can't copy and paste your search from Medline into CINAHL. It has to be rewritten for each one. And so that can take a lot of time. But once you do have all the studies from your search, what you do is you have to screen to see which ones are to be included. So screening takes place in 2 stages. The first is primary screening, in which you look at titles and abstracts only. And this is done in duplicate and independently, so you have 2 people doing it on their own. And they go through the titles and abstracts using the predefined inclusion-exclusion criteria that you develop when you do your search strategy. So you have this criteria. The important thing is to stick to it. So you go through each of the titles and abstracts and you say yes or no. And then anything that gets a yes by either of the 2 screeners goes through to secondary screening. And secondary screening involves the full paper. And again, it's done in duplicate and independently. And then if there's any difference in opinion, you can either use consensus or you can get a third party to make a decision. It's also important, too, at this stage to keep track of your screening numbers. There is a reporting strategy for systematic reviews called PRISM, and many journals won't publish your paper without it. And so generally your figure 1 is going to track your screening numbers. So this is an example of a systematic review I'm currently working on. So you can see in the top left-hand corner, those were the total records that we found within the databases without duplicates. We also found some from gray sources, so that's 70. So together we had to screen just over 2,800 records. So we did that for titles and abstracts. So primary screening is where you get rid of about 90% of your citations. And you can see we did 41 full text records, and we excluded 17 of those. And 3 were because of incorrect study design, 5 had the wrong population, and 9 had the wrong intervention. So overall, we included 24 studies. So once you have those 24 studies, you want to assess their quality. And your aim here is to minimize bias. So in order to do that, we're looking at risk of bias. And so this addresses internal validity. Internal validity is bias that is caused by systematic error. It's not random, so if you repeat this research study over and over again, you're going to end up with the same error every time due to the way the study was designed. So some examples of a risk of internal validity might be blinding, or participant selection is biased, or the number of patients who are lost to follow-up. And there are a number of validated tools specific to each study design. So if you were reviewing RCTs, you would want to use the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool. Or if you were looking at cohort studies, you might consider the Newcastle-Ottawa scale. So there are literally hundreds of different tools. There isn't really a right answer as to which one you choose, as long as it matches your study design and that you consistently apply it to all your papers. The second step of quality assessment is grade. And this was developed by Cochrane, and it's called Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation. And what it does is assesses the quality of the evidence and the strength of the recommendations. And it does so using 6 domains. The first is risk of bias, which you've already addressed in your quality assessment. It also looks at inconsistency. So that's the heterogeneity or the differences between the papers. One of the domains is indirectness. So if you're comparing the same population, it's that apple versus oranges argument compared to oranges versus oranges. The next is imprecision. So if you have very wide confidence intervals, your results tend to be less precise. It also addresses publication bias, so that studies that have negative results tend not to be published, whereas studies that have positive results are often more found in the published literature. So using these 6 domains, each paper is scored on a high, moderate, low, or very low score to reflect the assessor's confidence in the quality of that study. So next you want to move on to data extraction, and your aim here is for accuracy and completeness. And so you do data extraction whether you're doing a statistical meta-analysis with quantitative data or whether you're doing a narrative summary. In each case, you want to do extraction with independent confirmation, so that could be 20 or 25% of the volume is confirmed by an independent person. It's always helpful to pre-specify what data you want to extract. You never want to go back and reread your 50 papers to find that one piece of information you forgot to collect the first time. So it's always good to do a little bit of pilot testing before you start. And so analyzing your results. So the aim here is to do so in an unbiased and an appropriate manner. An appropriate manner is important. Just because you have quantitative data doesn't mean you should do a meta-analysis. It might not be appropriate, especially if the studies are clinically diverse. The results would be meaningless. And you might not want to combine studies of poor quality because you could end up with misleading results. So the type of analysis should be determined during protocol development, but that could always change. So if you are doing a meta-analysis, quantitative data, you would most likely use Review Manager, and this is a program that's available free from Cochrane, and this is a screenshot of what it might look like. So we've included all the studies, we've done the data extraction, they've been weighted, and they've undergone meta-analysis, and on the right you can see the forest plot, and in this case it favors right, which is the control in this case. And then last but not least, you've done all the work, so now you get to write up the paper. And one way to do that is to follow the PRISMA guidelines. So these are the reporting standards that are specific to systematic reviews, and it will make sure that you haven't left out anything in your paper. A lot of journals will require you to fill out the PRISMA form and submit it with your paper to make sure you haven't missed anything. And this is why I started with KT. When you talk about KS, we always come back to KT. So you have your results, but you don't want your research to end up in that valley of death. So it's important to think about knowledge translation and how you might move forward in order to implement your findings. So that's me. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me either with general questions or about your specific projects. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Megan, for that very intriguing presentation. So as we mentioned earlier on at the beginning of the webinar, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. As I can see, we do have one waiting for Dr. Meghan Sebastianski to answer. So I'll read it up for you. Our viewer, Christine, has written, is it important to use the same set of tools for all of the articles reviewed, i.e. CAS?
Yeah, that's a good question. Depends on the study design. So if you have RCTs and cohort studies in the same review, then you would use a tool specific for RCTs for those studies, and you would use the tool specific for cohort studies for the cohort studies. So there's no limit to the number of tools that you would use for each study design, but you just have to pick one per study design.
Thank you. Our next viewer, Anastasia, sorry if I have butchered your name, has asked, what do you do if you conduct a systematic review but do not find a lot of evidence to answer your research question?
Or the results are inconclusive.
Yeah.
It happens. That itself is a finding that can be useful to researchers. It usually means that there isn't a lot of evidence in that area, and perhaps it's something where you need to do more primary research. And even inconclusive results or very small bits of evidence can be important. I've seen systematic reviews published through Cochrane, which is the leader of systematic reviews, that only had 2 papers. So it's never too small.
Oh, thank you. That is a very informative answer and a very good question. Our next question comes from Miriam. She asks, do you have any tips on how to conduct a stakeholder consultation as part of a scoping review?
Yeah, patient engagement or stakeholder engagement is a really big part of the research that we do. Stakeholders can often help define the question, especially not only what question to ask, but how broad to take it. So if they can help you determine scope, in this case, the breadth or the depth of the question that you would like. And sometimes we have patients or stakeholders who are involved in the entire process of the scoping review. They've been involved in the screening process. They've helped determine which data points should be extracted, and they've even helped with some of the quality assessment and helped write up the final manuscript. So it's not just at the beginning, they can be involved throughout the entire process.
Thank you again for that answer. So we do have, we do have more typing going on. So as I mentioned, we do have quite a bit of time for you to ask some questions, and Megan is very willing to answer them. So please do type in any questions you might have in the chat box. Goodness. Okay, so Christine has asked, will these slides be available after the session? Yes, they will be. We will send them out to you through email with the slides, as well as a link to the archived webinar. So for anything that you may be a bit fuzzy on, or didn't quite catch during the presentation, you can rewatch it. All right, so I think that there's no more typing going on.
You're all KS experts now.
Oh, we do have one more typing. But yeah, so do please refer to Meghan's contact information if you do have further questions. Again, we have lots of time, so if you would like for us to answer anything. Oh goodness. So as I said, in response to Homa's question, which is where can we find the slides, we will email them to you. So once the session has ended, you should receive an email from our training coordinator that will give you the slides as well as the link to the archived webinar, as well as some additional information that might be helpful and can be helpful for us, such as our evaluation. If you do not receive those or an email, please do check your spam. Sometimes it seemingly goes into that mailbox. Or just send us an email and we will happily send them along to you.
Oh, thank you very much.
So I'll just see what everyone else is typing. Oh, so we have one more question. Heather asks, or I guess comments, she's wondering if the discussion section of the scientific journal article is considered KS, just to kind of help her understand the term.
I generally wouldn't apply knowledge synthesis to the discussion section. Knowledge synthesis, it is in a way, but it's just a very, very small piece. Knowledge synthesis is really taking multiple primary articles and analyzing them, synthesizing them into one overall answer, whereas within a discussion section, you're discussing your results and how they compare to other primary studies. So a little bit of a different goal there, and definitely different methodology.
So we have another question. The majority of meta-analysis I have seen in systematic review reports relative risk, categorical or yes or no data, but it is possible to conduct a meta-analysis on continuous data.
It is. Thanks, Prab. So if you're doing, say, survival or hazard risk, you could do a meta-analysis on that. It's a lot more difficult, so I would suggest that you use a statistician. And we do have one available through the SPORE support unit if anyone needs some help with that.
All right. So seeing no more typing, unless you do start typing now, I think that does draw us to the end of our webinar. Again, please refer to Meghan's contact information if you have any further questions. Oh, we might have another question. But just after the session as well, if you do randomly have a knowledge synthesis crisis, do please feel free to email Meghan, and she'll happily respond. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you again, Meghan, for presenting. I think, as everyone has mentioned, this has been quite informative and quite helpful. I'd like to extend another thank you to all the webinar participants who joined us today. For anyone who came in late, again, I will mention one last time that the session has been recorded, and a link to view the webinar will be emailed to all registered participants. Again, that does include the slides and any additional assistance you might need. Just feel free to email us. We also will include a link to sign up for our communique, where we will share information about upcoming events and activities, as well as a short webinar evaluation, as I mentioned previously. Next week, we will be co-hosting a webinar with the Saskatchewan SPORE KT platform titled KT Approaches in Patient-Oriented Research in Saskatchewan and Alberta. This webinar will take place on Wednesday, April 12th at 2 p.m., both in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The link to sign up for this webinar will also be emailed to you later today. So lastly, on behalf of the Alberta SPORE Knowledge Translation Platform, I'd like to wish everyone a great day and hope you'll join us again next time.